Hi guys. Before we proceed to this video, we've got something very important to share with you. Neoliberalism, Inequality and Authoritarianism by Professor John V. Kofis is available for purchase. You can order it directly from the publisher Little French eBooks or through Amazon.
Hello, welcome. Every year in September, the United Nations General Assembly holds its annual meeting to discuss various issues from geopolitical to geoeconomic, human rights, as well as climate change, among others like poverty, for example. This year, at the top of the agenda was the two-state solution, which really dates back to the Truman administration in 1948 when Israel was created by the Zionist entity. And there was an expressed statement that there must be a two-state legacy from the Palestinian mandate, which existed before Israel, before the Zionists, of course, created the state of Israel. Nothing like that, of course, has existed. Instead, the Palestinian people became second-class citizens under what many international human rights organizations, including UN entities, rapporteurs, call apartheid conditions, not very different from what existed in South Africa before Nelson Mandela was released from prison in 1990. So this was at the top of the agenda, the two-state solution. In part, as we will see, for a lot more reasons than it might appear on the surface, considering that the two-state solution vote in the General Assembly is non-binding, that there is no enforcement mechanism, and considering that the United States remains solidly behind Israel, and the United States, of course, is the world's most important military power, given that it spends anywhere from 9 to and more on defense than the next 9 to 11 countries combined, the next countries combined in the world. So the US has, in fact, the largest defense budget in the world, spending about 3.5 times more than China, for example, which comes second. As a general statement, let me point out that there is quite a bit of analysis, although this is continuing to take place. I believe the last day of the UN General Assembly meeting in New York City will be Monday, the 29th of September. And they're on to other issues now, like climate change and so forth. But at the top of the agenda was the issue of the two-state solution against the background of the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, United Nations, international human rights organizations, even including Israeli ones, by the way, and most countries in the world, including a major U.S. politician, former presidential candidate, Senator Bernie Sanders, agree what has been happening since October 2023 is genocide. And at the same time, famine. This is, of course, the background against which the UN, the majority, 80% of the members of the General Assembly voted for a two-state solution. A number of them had already agreed to that before, and it's just that more followed. The question, let me just say about in general, is to what degree was this meeting significant? On the one hand, we have the President of the United States, Donald Trump, saying the UN is irrelevant. The UN is an organization where people, heads of state or representatives, foreign ministers attend, or diplomats attend, to basically engage in vacuous rhetoric, which is absolutely meaningless. It's a waste of time. Nothing works, even the escalator and the teleprompter. It's just a horrible organization. And it doesn't mean anything. On the other hand, there are analysts who have looked at what happened this week, since September 22nd, when the meeting, I believe, started, and it ends on the 29th, in New York, in the UN General Assembly. There is the other side, and then there are interpretations in between about the significance of this meeting this year, 2025. There are those, and I think I'm in more agreement with that group, that argue that what we have here is really a major shift in political realignment. And this is primarily because France and Saudi Arabia collaborated on the issue of using the issue, of course, of the two-state solution, but really collaborated in order so that Europe can remain relevant against the background of a United States that is increasingly isolationist, more hostile to Europe and to the world, and has determined the regional balance of power in the Middle East and the global balance of power from Truman to the present. And so there is that interpretation. And I mean, I'm going to delve into some issues to explain where I stand on this, because really that interpretation, the extreme opposite of where Trump stands, namely the president said, well, this is just irrelevant. These people are just talking. This is empty rhetoric. They're not saying anything. Basically castigating them as wasting their time and nothing more, because they're not about solutions and they're only about rhetoric. Okay. The other side is that this is very significant insofar as this is really not what happened in the last week of September, is that this is not just about Israel and the US role in Israel, but rather this is about global realignment, regional in terms of Europe, Middle East, rapprochement, a new effort led by the French and the Saudis in the Middle East to basically sideline the United States and try to integrate the Palestinian state, presumably, if it ever takes place. There's a lot of ifs. That's why I'm hesitant about embracing this position either. And going into a gradual step-by-step approach that if certain things do not happen, then Europe, as well as the Saudi-led Arab states, Muslim states, I should say, not just Arab states, because Turkey and others of Pakistan are going to be included in this, considering, by the way, there was recent major rapprochement between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. That what will happen, there are going to be gradual steps. There have already been some steps to actually isolate Israel, to have some of the trade relations scaled back, diplomatic relations scaled back. Some countries individually have put a pause on some major development contracts that Israel had in Muslim countries. And the next step is going to be for the Europeans. I mean, France has been for decades a weapon supplier, let's face it, for Israel. They're going to look at that. They're going to take a look at a lot of other issues. So, and the implication here is not only Israel is going to be isolated, they're going to bypass it, circumvent it, and try to integrate the Palestinians, deal with them economically, provide security guarantees for them. but they are going to, by implication, isolate the United States. And this only helps, it's obvious who the indirect beneficiaries are from all this. It's the BRICS group. It's the China-Russia-led BRICS group. China-led, I should say, not Russia, but it's the China-led BRICS group. They are inadvertently benefiting from all this. And of course, if one watches the videotapes from that are available by the Russians and the Chinese at the United Nations General Assembly and Security Council, you can see very clearly, and of course they're not making any secret about this, they haven't for months, that they've been preparing for this realignment. They were waiting and waiting in the wings for this for a long time, because they've been openly talking about global realignment and a shift away from the US hegemonic role in determining security issues and geoeconomic issues on a world scale, as including the Middle East, by the way. And so this is a real scenario here. The question is, and I'll explain what how Trump, who was well aware of this, not he personally, the staff working on this who informed him, and he went prepared. The staff prepared him to go in there and meet with a number of Muslim leaders and try to counter the European Saudi approach to this issue, that the U.S. really will be, in fact, if all of the scenario, if the scenario pans out, if it works out. And so, and I'll talk about that too. Now, let me just point out, by the way, that although this issue, this year's top issue was the two-state solution, the United States violated its own laws by not inviting the head of the PLO, Mahmoud Abbas, and 80 Palestinian officials who wanted to attend. This is a violation of the UN Charter, by the way. The United Nations is not an extension of the State Department or any foreign ministry. The United Nations happens to be in New York because the US, just for the record, the US created it, by the way. Yes, in consultation with other states, but the US was behind it. The US started this idea of a multilateral organization to prevent global conflict, to engage in conflict resolution through diplomacy. When Woodrow Wilson was president back in World War I, at the end of that war, at the Paris Treaty Conference, that's when peace conference, that's when the League of Nations idea, an American idea, came into being. The US never joined that organization, and that went nowhere. But Roosevelt, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, comes out of that Wilsonian internationalist multilateral position, if you will, tradition. And he and Cordell Hull, his Secretary of State, believed in such an organization that upheld certain international rules of law. And after all, this was created in San Francisco, and the headquarters are in New York. So it's as American as you can get. However, not an extension of the State Department. Although from 1945, when it was created, 1953, in other words, from Truman to the first year of the Eisenhower administration, the U.S. had its way with the UN. Anything it wanted, the UN voted with the U.S. After 1953, gradually what we see with the historical antecedents of the non-aligned movement, the Global South, in other words, going away from that heavy dependence on the U.S., and striking sort of a different route, a third way between the Soviet bloc, Maoist China, and the U.S. Now, the United States attempt to denigrate the UN is not new. The fact is that if it can't if the UN can't serve U.S. foreign policy interests, then what good is it? Well, if every country took that approach, or if the major countries took that approach, then it should be called the divided nations, not the United Nations. So there would be no purpose. They might as well dissolve it, which the U.S. would be happy. I guess some people in the U.S. would be, and they have made it very clear they would be happy with that. But the the UN serves a very useful purpose, and whenever, although the U.S. has really castigated the United Nations for a lot of reasons, whenever it needs it, the U.S. goes back to it, and it did so when it wanted to invade Iraq, and it provided evidence about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which are of course false, but nevertheless, it goes back to the UN when it serves its interests, and then it castigates the UN when it doesn't. Anyway, unilateralism has been around since Reagan, and it is an integral policy of the neoliberal GOP from Reagan to Trump. Now, the fact is that President Bush, both George Herbert Walker Bush and his son, were not unilateralists, they were multilateralists. But the current administration, in its first term as well as today, is unilateral. Unilateralism means going at it alone. It does not mean being against imperialism. It does not mean being against military intervention. It does not mean that the U.S. has an intention of forfeiting its hegemonic role in the world. Not at all. It just doesn't want to collaborate, and it doesn't want the consent of any other country. And this was very clear. President Trump said as much. In fact, some of the language that he used toward his fellow world leaders was unflattering, to say the least, as well as against the United Nations, for which I guess he holds in very low regard. Now, the fact is, however, the French-Saudi coalition, if you will, because this was well prepared. This is not happened spontaneously, by the way. They were planning this for months. The U.S. knew about it, and one of the reasons Trump went in there and was very harsh in his tone against his fellow world leaders was because he knew what the vast majority of the world leaders were up to, led by historic ally France. Now, there are two very important historic allies of the United States, the United Kingdom and France. And when they abandon you and they go with a two-state solution, and they collaborate with the Saudi plan and integrating a future Palestine state, sovereign state, and sidelining Israel, providing security for the presumably, if it ever takes place, this Palestinian state, sidelining the United States for future conflict resolution, which of course the U.S., no conflict has ever been resolved without the somehow direct or indirect role of the United States, at the very least, the quiescence of the United States government since Truman, by the way. This is just people who have studied diplomatic history know this. And this is a new thing for the U.S. to be sidelined like this, using this issue. However, we'll see which way they go, because these countries can change. These governments not countries, but the governments can change their ways, and they can go any different route. Anyway, the fact is, of the 193 representatives at the General Assembly, roughly 80% agree with the French-Saudi position. The Israelis, of course, in the United States, had been lobbying for a long time. They knew this was coming. They had been lobbying against it. Both Israeli government officials as well as U.S. government officials castigated those who were going to come to the UN in September and basically support the two-state solution, dismissing them as siding with terrorism, arguing that they are anti-Semitic, something to which they even accused France of that. Macron took offense to it. Anyway, of course, anti-Semitism has been used to castigate anyone, to criticize anyone who criticizes the state of Israel, Israeli policy. So anti-Semitism has been equated with anti-Zionism, and the two are two very different things. Historically, anti-Semitism goes back 1,000 years, if not 1,000 years at the very least. In other words, the Crusades, the early Crusades. But if not that, especially during the Black Death, as this scholar Barbara Tuchman in her book Distant Mirror points out, this is a very long situation here. It goes way back in the European tradition, anti-Semitism. It is not so with Zionism. Zionism is a fairly recent creation of the late 19th century, basically coming out of social Darwinism, nationalism, imperialism. It is a situation where Europeans basically influenced European Jews who wanted to create their own state, and they and these Zionists basically found that opportunity during World War II and created the state of Israel. Anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are very, very different. Shortly, I believe I will be doing a session on that as well. Now, the interesting thing is that in 1988, when the PLO, which now the U.S. says is the legitimate entity, although it would not allow PLO representatives to attend the UN session, the PLO declared in 1988 an independent statehood for Palestine. And back then, immediately Israel and the United States, and even a few of the allies of Western allies of Israel, dismissed the PLO as a terrorist organization. They're doing the exact same thing now, and with Hamas, and arguing now that anyone recognizing the two-state solution is basically rewarding terrorism and Hamas. To which, by the way, the president, first of all, let me just say this on that issue, because that this made news. The government of Ireland announced that really we have to be realistic, that Hamas is an integral part, at the very least, of Gaza, of the Palestinian people in Gaza. It's been there for a long time. Their unconventional means of warfare aside, they are an integral part of that. And the second thing is that both the president of Brazil, President Luiz Lula, as well as the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, responded to Israel and to the United States charges that this is rewarding terrorism and Hamas. They argued that anyone who does not recognize the two-state solution and allows this genocide war and the famine to continue is an extremist. In other words, they turn the tables around and call the other side, implying the other side are terrorists, state terrorists, for agreeing to this, to not ceasing. Not agreeing to cease fire, as we'll see the U.S., as we have seen, by the way, not as we'll see, as we have seen, the U.S. has vetoed every resolution of the United Nations Security Council calling for a ceasefire and a permanent solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So the idea here is the idea here is really to put pressure behind the French-Saudi proposal, to put pressure on the US and Israel to come to the table and seek a diplomatic solution to the crisis, using the UN, by the way, as a vehicle, which is a global organization, to put pressure, world pressure, on these two countries to do so. Now, globally, it is no secret that the vast majority in public opinion polls, this includes the United States, by the way, and Western Europe, which is historically pro-Israel, globally, the vast majority of the world's population, according to public opinion polls, is not on the side of Israel. It is a tiny minority that supports Israel. Just as governments globally support the two-state solution and are against genocide and famine, similarly, the population of the world, according to public opinion polls, is on the side of the Palestinian people, of the victims. The world also sees the hypocrisy on the part of the United States and some Western countries when they side with the victim in the case of Ukraine, which of course has been subjected to war that Russia started, given the security concerns that it has regarding Ukraine's integration into NATO and the West economically. Whereas the same criteria does not apply to the Palestinian people, partly because of racism, partly because of Islamophobia, partly because they're Muslims, they're not Christians or Jews. So you have a double standard here, and the world has noticed it, especially when you look at, by the way, when you look at Global South press coverage and social media and so forth. What you find is that in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, the sentiment is not that of much of the West. Even in the West, however, they do see the double standard, that there's one standard for white Ukrainians, another for dark Muslim Palestinians. And this goes back to the issue of, is there Islamophobia and racism involved here? Now, the United States did have the support at the United Nations of Germany and Italy, which did not go along with the French Saudi led group. The Germans and the Italians, however, mass demonstrations, by the way, both in Germany and in Italy, against their governments for siding with Israel on this issue, and pressure on them to accept the two-state solution. Now, just for the record, both in Germany and in Italy, these two countries, they argued that yes, we don't, because they are, Hamas is a terrorist organization and all that, the usual stuff. However, they set certain conditions that they would join the 80% of the world's governments, the members of the UN, and agree to a two-state solution, assuming that Hamas is completely sidelined and certain conditions are met with regard to the security of Israel. By the way, with regard to the security of Israel, Israel has nuclear weapons, and it is one of the major, it's a tiny country, and a major military power with the force of the United States behind it. So the idea that somehow its security is threatened is, I don't know, it's questionable, at the very least, considering that it has been the aggressor, by the way. And all along, while let me say this, in the last about 6 months, when all of this preparation was taking place from behind the scenes. And it wasn't so much behind the scenes. Everybody knew. Governments knew because they spy on each other. In any case, some of it was in the press. While there was a lot of preparation for this UN General Assembly meeting to endorse Palestinian sovereignty, guess what Israel was doing? It was bombing its neighbors and intensified the campaign in Gaza of ethnic cleansing and famine. So what we have is, and the world was watching, this is the age of technology where instant communications are a reality. So what we have is the Europeans, in many respects, looking at this and saying, yeah, if instead of demonstrating some flexibility toward the diplomatic solution, what did they do? They bombed Qatar, Doha, a civilian neighborhood where there were Hamas negotiators. By the way, they were there in Qatar. Qatar is an intermediary negotiator, and it has continued with the UN meeting. It had a meeting with Muslim countries, and Trump was there as well. And it agreed that he wants to continue in that role, although he was bombed. And the US was complicit, according to many reports. We don't know that UK may have been complicit as well, in providing refueling for some of the planes, because Qatar is far from Israel, and those planes needed refueling to get back. Anyway, but they agreed. So now the fact that they kill, the fact that the state of Israel assassinates negotiators from the other side, no matter who they are, okay, they are Hamas, they did carry out the October terrorist act, and that is condemned universally, obviously, and it should be. It's a form of unconventional warfare. Israel is familiar with that because that's what it has been doing. That's how it became a state in the 1940s, by the way, carrying out unconventional warfare. And so what does it do? It carries out unconventional warfare. It assassinates the very negotiators who want ceasefire and some kind of a permanent solution to the conflict. So that sent a signal to the Europeans, sort of justifying what they were scheming to begin with. So it hardened their position to go ahead. And at the same time, the carte blanche on the part of the United States and the billions pouring in, no restrictions on arms supplies, what are the Israelis, the IDF uses for it? The Israeli Defense Force uses that for to further destroy Gaza, which is a parking lot by now. Most of Gaza is a parking lot. And of course, on top of that, finally, there is the announcement by the Netanyahu government that he wants to annex Gaza. So no more Gaza. And what happens to the Palestinians? Ethnic cleansing, send them somewhere else, somebody else take them. So all of this really hardened the position of countries voting for the two-state solution at the UN. And as the Chinese representative, the Chinese government representative at the United Nations pointed out, this is not, and the Chinese look at everything from the prism of economic development on a world scale, because they are the largest economy in the world, by the way, in purchasing power parity, 10 trillion ahead of the US. So they're looking at everything. So the Chinese representative starts talking, and he's saying, well, this is not in the interest of world economic development. It's destabilizing, and destabilization that the US has made a way of life with Israel at the forefront has to stop. We want to get back to the road of more economic development, not military destabilization. So there is that angle of it. And the Europeans understood that because they have low GDP growth for a number of years now, from COVID to the present, these wars in Ukraine and in Israel. And they recognize that conflict resolution management that the US has been engaged to is all about how can the US use conflict resolution management, as it did during the Cold War, to secure its hegemony and prevent China from the China-led BRICS group with Russia as its second partner and India in there, to prevent them from displacing the US as the hegemonic power. Well, the question is, to what degree is that in the interest of Europe? That's a real issue. That's been debated by diplomats, by the way, and scholars alike. Now, the recognition issue of Israel, those who have looked at it, by the way, may have noticed that it did not call for any punishment of Israel for its, what the ICC, the ICJ, the United Nations have declared, that, not to mention international human rights organizations, war crimes. It did not call for that. On the contrary, they called for the security of Israel and its right to exist. The issue here is not to punish Israel in the manner that Israel and the United States are portraying it. The issue is, as the UN Secretary General pointed out, and the President of Brazil pointed out, the issue here is really to provide the right of the Palestinians to national sovereignty, the right to exist. So the right to exist on the part of Israel should not negate the right to exist on the part of the Palestinians. That's all this is about. It's a very simple formula. However, the US and the Israelis especially, and some of their supporters around the world, countries, mostly authoritarian countries, like Hungary, Viktor Orban's Hungary, and Javier Milei's Argentina. Those countries, of course, are with the US and with Israel, but very clearly they are listed in human rights organizations, by human rights organizations and most observers, as authoritarian countries, by the way. These are authoritarian liberals that have no qualms about using authoritarian tactics. They were with the US and Israel. The majority of the world was not. They lined up because behind France and Saudi Arabia. Now, there are those who have written, by the way, questioning the motives of many of the countries, Muslim and non-Muslim countries, including France, by the way. Yes, there are ulterior motives. France is in trouble, let's face it. President Macron has enormous socio-political problems because of the economy, because of the runaway deficit. That's all true. No doubt. There are many who have enormous domestic pressure because the public is on one side, it's on the side of the Palestinians against the state of Israel, and the government is on the other side. So the government is against its own people and using anti-Semitism the way the US, but not just the US, UK, Germany have used it to argue, you're going to be a dissenter, you're against the genocide in Gaza, you're anti-Semitic, we're going to arrest you. Well, the hypocrisy of that is just unbelievable, considering Jewish scholars of the Holocaust have come out and said so, and they're the experts on this matter. Anyway, there are other issues here. The failure of the United States to bring about a diplomatic solution on two fronts. Although the President of the United States went to the United Nations and boasted that he's ended 7 wars, and he listed those 7 wars, and people were scratching their heads. But let's put that aside. It doesn't matter. He has every right to do that, and every right to claim that he deserves the Nobel Prize. Whether he'll get it is another issue. But the real issue here is results. Rhetoric aside, President of the United States was absolutely right. UN is about rhetoric. Okay. Um, there's an old saying in the Middle East: the camel walking behind another one in front of it only sees the hump of the one in front of it. It doesn't see its own hump. This is the US. Vacuous rhetoric goes both ways. The fact is that the US has been hypocritical insofar as it has said that it wants to end wars, both in the Middle East as well as in Ukraine. And here we are at the end of September, and there is no end to war. And this meeting, I think, exposed that to a large degree. And the realignment, if it works out, you never know what happens, because a lot of these backdoor deals sometimes fall apart. But this realignment is really part of that. The failure of the United States to come through, to put some teeth to the rhetoric of this is the peace president, no war president. Well, so far there is forever war continuing. Biden was into forever war with the neoconservatives, so is Trump. Trump now has changed his mind even about Russia. The Vladimir Putin is no longer the good friend that he was. Trump now expects Europe to go full speed ahead against Russia. So what the Europeans are looking at is the US capable of conflict resolution management that doesn't really wreck their geopolitical standing and their geoeconomic? And they begin to face problems like the ones France has been having, and with runaway public debt. And so they're looking at this very seriously. Now, there are conditions to the two-state solution that the French-Saudi group set out. Hamas will have no role, none. There would be demilitarization, but when you look at the fine print, the fact is that the Europeans want to be the security guarantee of, if it ever comes to being, the Palestinian state. The US, of course, has a different plan, and I'll talk about the Trump plan that he presented. None of the details, by the way, were released, but someone leaked deliberately, obviously, from the White House the general schemes of this. There was no talk about, like I said, I've already mentioned this, about enforcing the ICC, ICJ court rulings and the UN rapporteur's Francesca Albanese's report regarding Israel's war crimes and role in Gaza. There was nothing like that. And there was, of course, the emphasis that the Palestinian state, presumably, if one comes to being, will be well integrated with the West. They really meant with Europe and the Arab countries. And they would bypass Israel. It would be directly with the Palestinians, not with Palestine, not through Israel. Okay, that's a nuance there that's important. Now, Trump gave a 55-minute speech, and he then met with Muslim leaders. Now, in the 55-minute speech, there was quite a bit. I watched the whole thing. At one point, he said, "I'm really good at this stuff. Your countries are going to hell." Okay, that's true. They may be. The question is who is responsible? But the elites of those countries, I would agree with him. Not that he's really good at this stuff. I would agree with the second part, that a lot of countries are not in very good position at all. And that is because the neoliberal political economy combined with runaway defense spending has diminished the civilian economies on a world scale. This is a fact that has been borne out by numerous studies throughout the world in different countries. So there is no doubt about this. Trump also castigated the members for unilaterally, although it's 80% of the General Assembly. It's not that Trump, the U.S. is unilateral. It's the rest of the world that's unilateral. Although it's a multilateral approach, this was interesting to see that 80% of the world's countries, members in the UN General Assembly, are unilaterally deciding on a two-state solution. However, the US, opposed to it, is not unilaterally deciding. This is the paradox of what, some of the things. But you have to take that with a grain of salt, what he said. Um, the thing is that what became very important in all of this is what he did afterwards. Unfortunately, they did not disclose any of the specifics to the public, to the press. There was a leaked memo that they did it deliberately, that he would propose a counter proposal to the French Saudi, presumably deal from behind the scenes. And the counter proposal would be, first of all, Muslim countries, not just Arab countries, Muslim countries would pay for the reconstruction of the Palestinian territories, especially Gaza, although Israel, with the full complicity of the United States, caused that mass destruction since October 2023. The Muslims will pay. So reconstruction costs would fall on the shoulder of Muslims. Okay. Muslims would also provide, Muslims, not Europeans, would provide through NATO. Muslim would provide military, that is defense support for a Palestinian entity that is, of course, free of any terrorist group and any that does not include any PLO, any group that is not linked to the PLO or recognizes the PLO. Indonesia actually went along with this and said, Indonesia, just for the record, has its own problems, by the way. Indonesia is led by a former defense minister, former general, authoritarian, mass demonstrations, especially by young people who suffer unemployment and underemployment in very high numbers. Not that the rest of South Asia isn't, by the way, but Indonesia immediately said, yeah, we'll send 20,000 troops of our own, 20,000 soldiers to provide these security guarantees. And so the Indonesians sided more with the Trump plan than with the Saudi-French plan. So that's something. Now, we don't know, because this is evolving in real time right now, what will happen, what will come of this. What we do know is what has transpired, because we have the historical record. And let me just say something, by the way, that is very important here, with that, in fact, none other than President Trump stated this. He did state that the war in Ukraine, he didn't say anything about Israel, but the war in Ukraine has been very profitable for the United States. The US has benefited because the Europeans are buying weapons to give to the Ukrainians. From the United States, they're buying weapons. Moreover, the US, under both Biden and Trump, had urged, and Trump continues to do this, the Europeans to become even more dependent on the United States for energy, for fossil fuels, for natural gas and for oil. Okay, not to go the route of renewable energy. In fact, during his 55-minute talk, the president basically did not say flattering things about climate change at all, and he's against the new technology he is in favor of fossil fuels. And he made it very clear he doesn't believe the climate change is real. He doesn't believe the scientists, and drill, baby, drill is the way to go. Okay. But I appreciate that he was honest. Honestly, I appreciate his honesty, that he said, "Look, we're making a lot of money from the forever war doctrine that actually is, it's not Trump's, it's Biden's." And the forever war doctrine, by the way, although he focused on Ukraine, pertains to Israel, as the United Nations report by Francesca Albanese stressed, because corporations have been making a lot of money from these wars, both of them, especially Israel, but Ukraine as well. So you have to appreciate here that in the short term, there are segments of the economy that make a lot of money. And the president was honest enough to at least admit part of that. And now, the reason I'm mentioning this is because I'm not optimistic at all about the conflict resolution alternative of the French-Saudi plan. I think that symbolically what happened at the United Nations in September 2025 was very important. Because once upon a time during the Cold War, it was communist countries and global South countries that supported Palestinians. Now it's everybody. It's the entire world. The US is really isolated. Diplomatic isolation of the United States comes as a result of yielding to corporate interests in the United States, Jewish and non-Jewish, it doesn't matter. That's not the issue here. And the Israeli lobby and pro-Zionist groups, Jewish and non-Jewish, by the way, again, conservative groups that support Zionism. They have nothing to do with Judaism. They're Christians, but they believe in all of this. And the isolation is the price that is paid. Isolation of the United States is a reality. And the institutional background, and I some time ago I did a video on the institutional crisis in the United States, is really it was really manifested at the United Nations. It's not because the U.S. president adopted such a harsh tone, so I should say, against his colleagues, against heads of state at the United Nations. It is part of, because foreign policy is really a reflection of domestic policy. And when you have Trump administration officials going public and saying that the Democratic Party, by the way, the US has a two-party system, unlike Europe, which has a multi-party system, electoral system. US has a two-party system. The only other party in the US of any consequence is the Democratic Party. And when the governing party right now, the GOP, there are officials from the GOP that say things like the Democrats are part of an extremist network, and they're extremists, sort of implying they're terrorists, after they have labeled domestic terrorists certain organizations which are linked to the progressive movement in the United States, like Antifa, for example, the anti-fascist. Antifa just simply means anti-fascist. That is kind of dangerous, because when the ruling party deems that the opposition must be delegitimized, okay, then why should the ruling party not have the head of state, namely President Trump, come to the UN and try to delegitimize the entire UN? Why not? You're against our policy toward Israel. I think you're irrelevant. You don't have legitimacy. We have legitimacy. Well, the rest of the world, of course, has a different view, and it's moving ahead with its own plans. I am not optimistic for the short term of where all of this is headed. I think that the reality is that Israel is isolated. The US is increasingly isolated. By the way, this is self-isolation. No one is imposing this. The U.S. Has an enemy, but it's not. It's really the elites. The elites of the United States have chosen a path in domestic and foreign affairs that has resulted in this self-isolation at the diplomatic level. This has consequences, by the way. This has consequences. And the consequences are ahead. We will see what course of action will be taken. I'm not optimistic about a two-state solution at all. However, in the short term, however, longer term, we will see if Israel and its greater Israel, Lebensraum, the German word for living space, Zionist plan to take as much land from the Palestinians and continue with ethnic cleansing and take land from neighbors prevails through forever war policy, because this is a war economy that Israel has, by the way, or if there is a realization on the part of the people of Israel, who right now by 80% of according to public opinion polls support this government and agree with it. We'll see if there is a change in that, but for right now, things are not looking that good, and we will see if the French-Saudi plan works out, or if the Trump plan works out, or if neither works out. Thank you very much, by the way, for listening, and by all means, sign up to this channel. It's an educational channel, and write comments, ask questions. Thank you very much.